It was the middle of September 2019, and I had just turned 31. I remember that year clearly because I had taken a break from everything. No work, no girlfriend, no calls, no social media. Just me, my truck, and the outdoors. I was from northern Georgia, but I had always wanted to explore more of Alabama. I had this old map I picked up at a flea market, and it showed a spot in the Talladega National Forest that looked good for camping. Off trail, deep in the woods, no people. That's what I was after. I packed up my stuff: tent, food, water, a couple flashlights, extra batteries, first aid kit, camping stove, some basic tools, and my old .38 snub revolver. I always took it with me, not because I expected trouble, but because I liked being prepared. You're alone in the woods. Things happen. You hear sounds. Sometimes you want peace of mind more than anything else. It was a Wednesday when I drove out there. I stopped in this small gas station near Heflin to fuel up, grabbed a coffee, and double-checked the directions I scribbled down from the map. The lady at the register looked like she wanted to say something when she saw where I was pointing, but she didn't. I didn't ask either. The road was rough. After a while, pavement turned into gravel, then gravel turned into dirt, and finally it was just me and some tire ruts surrounded by thick trees on both sides. I drove until I found this clearing by an old rusted sign barely hanging on one hinge. Couldn't read it. Looked like it used to be something official decades ago. Just behind that area, the trees thinned out again and the map showed a wide flat space. I hiked about 20 minutes and found it, perfect for setting up a tent. No one would find me there, but what I didn't realize, until I set up camp and walked around, was that just about 100 yards further east, there were the remains of some old sawmill. Not much left, just a half-collapsed roof, some rotted-out machinery, twisted steel beams, a pile of rusted tools, and broken crates. I guessed it had been shut down for at least 50 years, maybe more. It was weird how none of that showed on the map, but that's how it is with those old ones. Still, I didn't think much of it, just some forgotten piece of the past. I set up camp closer to the trees and further from the structure. That night, I cooked some sausages and beans, sat by the fire, and listened to the night. Crickets, a few owls, nothing unusual. But I remember, right before I went into my tent, hearing a thud, just one, dull and short. I stopped, flashlight in hand, scanned the woods, looked toward the sawmill. Nothing moved. I figured it might have been a pine cone dropping or something shifting as the air cooled. It was silent after that. I climbed in and went to sleep. Next morning was normal. Cold coffee, oatmeal, took a long walk down an old game trail. I kept my compass with me, but didn't go far. When I came back, I checked out the sawmill again. I walked carefully, watching where I stepped. The place had this eerie stillness to it, like it hadn't seen a person in decades. Sawdust still clung to the floor in spots. One of the rusted machines looked like it was made to cut whole logs. Another one, some conveyor belt, was cracked in half. In one corner of the structure was a hole in the floor where a hatch used to be. Looked like there was a crawl space or storage area below, but the wood around it had collapsed, and I wasn't dumb enough to try climbing down. I moved on, took a few photos with my phone, then headed back. That second night, I built a slightly bigger fire, cooked rice and tuna, and sat for a while, thinking about nothing. But then I started hearing something odd. Not an animal, not wind through trees. More like metal shifting, like something dragging. It came from the direction of the sawmill. It didn't last long, just a few seconds, then gone. I waited. Light from the fire flickered off the trunks of the trees. I stood up, grabbed my flashlight and gun, and walked a little closer to the edge of the clearing. Didn't see anything. I told myself, maybe old metal shifted as the air got cold again. That happens. But my gut didn't like it. That night, I kept the gun inside the tent, fully loaded, safety on. I didn't sleep great. Every twig snap sounded louder than it should have. I woke up every hour, I didn't want to leave yet, but something started to feel off. Next morning, I walked back to the sawmill just to clear my head and check things out in daylight. When I got there, I noticed footprints, old boot prints in the dirt. They weren't mine. They were newer. I wear a size 12 and these were smaller. Maybe size 9 or 10. I crouched down and looked closer. Not just one set, two. One had a different tread pattern. I looked around, listened. Silence. That's when I saw something else. One of the old broken crates I had seen the day before was now turned over. I was sure it hadn't been like that before. I would have noticed. I'm a careful person. Nothing was inside it, just wood rot and dirt. But still, someone had been there. While I was asleep, while I had walked off, I started to get uneasy. I turned around, walked straight back to camp, packed everything into my bag except the tent, and loaded it into the truck. I figured I'd stay one more night but sleep in the truck bed instead, just in case. It wasn't ideal, but it felt safer. That night, I kept the fire going longer than usual. I sat in the back of the truck with my sleeping bag rolled out, flashlight and revolver within reach. For the first few hours, nothing happened. It was quiet. Then, at some point after midnight, I heard it. Footsteps. They were slow, coming from the direction of the sawmill. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Then they stopped. I sat up, didn't move, didn't make a sound. I aimed the flashlight toward the trees but saw nothing. Then I heard them again, only now they were circling. Whoever it was, they were walking in a wide loop around my camp. I stayed still, kept the gun in my hand. I wasn't about to yell or shine the light around like some horror movie idiot. I just waited, listened. The footsteps got closer, then stopped again. And then, from behind a tree maybe 20 feet away, I heard breathing. I'm not even kidding. Slow, steady, human breathing. I raised the flashlight and turned it on, bright as hell. Hit the tree. Nothing. But just behind it, I caught a quick glimpse of someone stepping behind another trunk. Too fast to see much, but they were there. I called out once. Nothing aggressive, just loud enough to let them know I wasn't helpless. No answer, no sound. I kept the light on that spot for a long time. Eventually, I turned it off to conserve batteries, but I didn't sleep. I sat up all night with my back against the cab, gun across my lap. No more footsteps, no more breathing, just the endless chirping of crickets and the occasional crack of wood in the fire pit. When the sun came up, I didn't waste time. I threw the tent into the truck bed without folding it, slammed everything into gear, and drove. On the way out, I saw something hanging on the same rusted sign I had passed when I first arrived. It was a strip of torn denim tied around the corner. Faded, frayed, knotted like a ribbon. I hadn't noticed it before. I don't know who had been out there, or why they were sneaking around the sawmill and my camp in the middle of the night. But I know they weren't camping. They weren't lost. They had boots, they knew how to move quietly, and they didn't want to be seen. I drove straight to the nearest town, found a diner, and sat there for hours with 3 cups of coffee just trying to calm down. I didn't tell anyone. Not the waitress, not the guy behind the counter. What was I supposed to say? I haven't been camping alone since that trip. Not in the deep woods anyway. I still go out sometimes, but only to well-known parks. Places with people. Places with rangers. It's not because I'm scared of the woods. It's because I'm scared of the people who hide in them, and what they're doing when they think no one's watching. It was the summer of 2017, and I was 29 at the time. I had recently quit a sales job in Raleigh, North Carolina, and hadn't lined up anything else yet. I needed to clear my head. I'd saved up enough to take some time off, and I decided to spend a few weeks just moving around the state with my gear. I'd always enjoyed camping alone. It let me reset, and after the years I'd spent behind a desk, I was itching to get away from everything familiar. Most of the places I camped were just state parks or places near rivers, the kind of spots you could hike into with some effort. But during the second week of my trip, I started getting bored of the usual spots. I wanted something different. I wasn't looking for anything crazy, just a place off the beaten path. I remembered a conversation I'd overheard once about a hilltop cemetery near a small place called White Level. It wasn't anything big. It wasn't even on most maps. Apparently, the cemetery was old and forgotten, sitting way out on private land that hadn't been used in years. The kind of spot that didn't see much foot traffic. That's what caught my attention. I drove into White Level late in the day and parked about a mile from where I thought the cemetery might be. There wasn't much in the town. Just a few homes, some spread out fields, and a closed-down gas station with cracked windows. I double-checked my backpack, filled with water, food, a tarp, a light sleeping bag, and a headlamp. I had my knife and small hatchet, plus an old army surplus poncho that had saved me during more than one storm. I'd marked the route on an offline map, but the land around the cemetery was mostly overgrown with thick brush, and the dirt road that used to lead there was blocked by a downed tree. I left the car where it wouldn't be seen from the road and hiked the rest of the way in. Took me about an hour and a half of slow hiking to find it. The graveyard sat at the top of a hill surrounded by dying trees and overgrown grass. It wasn't big, maybe 30 or 40 headstones, all weathered and uneven. Some had fallen over completely. The fence that used to surround it had mostly collapsed, and the old gate hung sideways, swinging a little in the light breeze. There were broken beer bottles in one corner, maybe from teenagers or hunters passing through, but no real sign of recent use. No trash, no tire tracks. Felt like no one had been up there in a long time. The sun was dropping fast, and the light turned everything into that yellow-orange glow that makes shadows stretch out across the ground. I picked a flat area near the base of a dead tree and laid down my tarp and sleeping bag. I wasn't planning on building a fire. It didn't feel right in a place like that. I just wanted a quiet night. Maybe that was a dumb idea. I ate a cold sandwich from my pack, drank a little water, and just sat there for a while, leaning back against the tree and watching the sky darken. You could see the stars clearly from up there. There were no lights, no engines in the distance, no planes, nothing. Just wind and bugs and the occasional rustle of a small animal in the brush. I remember thinking it was peaceful, almost too peaceful. I didn't sleep right away. I rarely do the first night in a new spot. Instead, I lay in the bag, watching the tree branches above shift back and forth. Around midnight, I finally started to doze off. I think I was asleep for maybe an hour when I woke up suddenly. Not from a sound, just a feeling, like my body knew something wasn't right. I lay there for a while, eyes wide, ears straining. I heard the wind, faint as ever, and the occasional creak of branches. But underneath that, I caught something else. A soft shuffle, like grass being pressed down by feet, but slow, like someone trying not to be heard. I stayed still, breathing shallow through my nose, and reached slowly for the knife I kept near my pack. The sound stopped. I waited. 10 seconds. 20. Nothing. Then I heard it again, off to my left. A footstep. Definitely a footstep. I turned my head slowly in that direction. The moon was out, casting just enough light to see shapes. And I saw one. A figure. Not close, but definitely human, standing halfway between me and the old fence line, barely more than a silhouette. I thought maybe it was a hunter, or someone who'd come up here to do something illegal and hadn't expected to find anyone else around. But the figure wasn't moving, just standing, watching. That was what got to me.
No flashlight, no noise.
Just standing there in the open. I stayed still and didn't say a word. I didn't want to startle him. I didn't want him to think I was a threat. I thought maybe if I didn't move, he'd go away. But then he took a step closer. I sat up slowly, making sure he could see my hands. I even raised one hand just slightly, hoping it would show I wasn't trying to cause trouble. But he didn't respond. Another step. Then he stopped again. I wasn't going to wait to see what he wanted. I rolled up onto one knee, slipped the knife into my belt, and grabbed my bag. I didn't bother with the sleeping gear. I just stood and backed away slowly, moving toward the far side of the hill. I didn't turn my back to him. When I glanced back once more, he was gone. I stopped, waited, listened. Nothing. Just the trees and wind again. I moved down the hill slowly, flashlight off. I didn't want to be a glowing target in the dark. I figured I could put some distance between us and maybe find another spot deeper into the woods. But I didn't get far. Maybe 10 minutes down the hill, I heard something else. A metallic sound like a chain link clinking. I froze. The sound came again. Then a creak, like an old hinge moving slowly. The only thing with a hinge up there was the broken graveyard gate. I turned around and climbed a low rise to see back toward the hilltop. Nothing. The graveyard looked the same, but something didn't feel right. I waited.
Knees bent.
Breath slow. That's when I saw movement again. This time, two figures. One standing. One crouching near the tree I had been sleeping under. They weren't talking.
No lights.
Just moving slowly, like they were searching. I didn't wait to see more. I dropped low and moved quickly into the thicker brush, staying quiet. I got scratched by branches and thorns, but I kept going. I didn't look back again. I must have hiked for another hour before I found a shallow gully with enough cover to feel safe. I got down there and didn't even try to sleep. I just crouched in the mud and waited for the sky to lighten. The sun took forever to rise. My legs ached, and I kept jerking awake whenever my head nodded down. Around 6, with light finally pushing through the trees, I made my way back in the direction of my car. I circled wide around the graveyard, keeping my distance. I didn't want to run into anyone who might still be there. When I finally reached the road, I felt the first real wave of relief. My car was where I'd left it. I got in fast and drove away without even checking my mirrors until I was a few miles out. I didn't call the police. I didn't have enough to tell them. No one hurt me. I didn't see anything clearly. I camped where I wasn't supposed to be. I figured it would be better to just leave it alone. I drove straight back to Raleigh and stayed at my brother's place for a few nights. I didn't even unpack. I kept thinking about those two figures. What were they doing up there? Why no lights? No talking? Why were they searching my spot? It's been years since that night. I haven't camped alone since. I still love the outdoors, but I stick to campgrounds now. Somewhere with people nearby. Somewhere with cameras. Somewhere that feels safe. That graveyard wasn't haunted. There weren't any ghosts, but what I saw was worse than anything made up. It was real. Just people, just men. But whatever they were doing up there, it wasn't innocent. They weren't hikers. They weren't campers. They were there for something else. And they didn't expect me. If I hadn't woken up, if I hadn't left my gear behind, I don't know what would have happened. But I got out, and I won't ever go back. I was 34 the summer I decided to spend a week alone camping in southern Utah. It was late July of 2017, and I'd been burned out from work. I just quit my job at a design firm in Salt Lake City, and before figuring out what was next, I wanted to clear my head. I didn't want noise. I didn't want my phone. I wanted silence and long, dry desert air and the kind of peace that only came from being absolutely alone. I'd camped before, mostly forest sites in Idaho, sometimes out near the Tetons, but this time I was going deeper into the desert, somewhere unfamiliar. I picked a place far from the big parks, a plateau called Drywolf Mesa, southeast of Escalante. It wasn't part of a tourist circuit, but I found it in a forum where someone mentioned it was untouched and brutally quiet. That's what I wanted. I packed light but smart. My old 4-person tent, a new water filter system, a loaded pack with essentials, a revolver I'd taken from my father's old house, and a satellite phone I rented last minute just in case. I told my younger brother I'd check in with him after the trip and gave him the map coordinates. After that, I drove 5 hours south on Highway 89, then spent another 2 hours weaving down gravel and dirt roads until I couldn't go any farther. I parked the Jeep under a stubby pinyon tree and started hiking with my pack. The land was sun-cracked and wild. High canyon rims, dry washes, red dust, and the smell of sage in the wind. It was lonely country, like walking on the surface of another planet. I hiked until I found a flat shelf above a dry creek, about 2 miles from where I'd parked, then set up camp. The first 2 days were perfect. I didn't see another soul. I didn't hear engines or phones or people, just birds and the occasional rustle of brush in the breeze. I filtered water from a trickle that came down the rocks, cooked canned beans and jerky on a little stove, and slept under skies so wide and starry it made me feel microscopic. I took long hikes during the day, carefully tracking my path with flagging tape tied to bushes so I could find my way back. I saw some deer tracks, maybe some coyote scat, but nothing threatening. I didn't even carry the revolver most of the time, but something changed on the third night. It was around 2 a.m. when I woke up. Not to a sound, not to a light, just a feeling. My eyes opened and I was wide awake, like I'd been pulled out of a dream with my chest tight and my skin cold. I sat up inside the tent. Everything outside was dead quiet, not even the wind. I unzipped the tent a few inches and peeked out. The desert was black and still. My fire had gone out. The stars were clouded over. I thought maybe a coyote had wandered close and that's what woke me up. I stayed awake another half hour, just listening. But there was nothing. The next morning, I found something strange. About 20 yards from my tent, I saw prints in the dirt. Human boots. Not mine. The treads were different, deeper and narrower. At first I thought maybe I'd walked there the day before and forgot. But I followed them and they came from nowhere, then disappeared near the creek bed. No vehicle, no trail. Just maybe 8 or 9 heavy steps pressed into the dust and then nothing. I stood there for a long time staring at them. My gut started turning. I went back to camp and unpacked the revolver. Loaded it. I didn't want to leave yet. I told myself maybe a rancher passed through. Maybe a hunter. But it didn't sit right with me. Whoever it was walked in and walked out quietly at night and didn't leave a trail. That meant they were either being careful or they were used to moving like that. That whole day I couldn't settle. I stayed close to camp. I didn't hike. I kept checking the tree line. That night I didn't sleep much. I kept the revolver in my hand inside the sleeping bag. I thought maybe I'd imagined the prints. Maybe it was a trick of the light. The next morning, I found something worse. The tape I'd tied on my hiking route was gone. Every piece of it. I tied 6 or 7 strips on my loop 2 days before. Bright orange trail tape. All of them were gone. Not broken or blown off, gone. Like someone had come and peeled each one off deliberately. I checked again. Hiked the trail I'd taken. Not a single scrap left. That trail was how I knew I'd get back to my Jeep. If someone had removed those on purpose, it meant they wanted me to get lost. I felt it in my stomach again. That twisting fear that keeps your mouth dry. I packed my gear that afternoon. I wasn't going to stay any longer. I figured I could retrace my steps back to the Jeep by the terrain. I had my map and I had a pretty good sense of direction. But when I got to where I thought I'd parked, I couldn't find it. The landscape was playing tricks on me. The ridges and washes started to blur together. I climbed one bluff after another, scanning below for the pinyon tree I'd parked under. Nothing. I spent 4 hours trying to locate it. The sun was going down fast, and the heat was cooking me from the inside. I had enough water for the night, but I felt it, panic creeping in like a slow leak. I set up my tent again in a higher spot and watched the basin below through my binoculars. I was too afraid to light a fire. I chewed some jerky and drank a little water. I tried the satellite phone, but the signal kept blinking in and out. Couldn't get a lock. That night, I stayed awake listening. Just after midnight, I saw a light. A small, pale light moving through the lower part of the canyon. Not firelight too steady, like a flashlight or a headlamp. It was maybe 300 yards away, moving slowly between the rocks. I watched it for 15 minutes. Then it turned off. I didn't sleep at all. I sat there gripping the revolver, heart thumping in my ears. No sound came, just the feeling that something was nearby, something watching. In the morning, I made a new plan. I marked my camp on the GPS and started hiking in a wide spiral to find the Jeep. I hiked all morning. Around noon, I found something that made my heart stop. Boot prints again. Same tread as before. But this time, they circled around a rock ledge and led straight to a small flat spot where ashes from a fire pit sat cold. Someone else had been camping nearby recently, and they'd left no sign except the coals and those boots. I followed the prints a little farther and found something else. An empty can of beans, the same brand I was eating. The label had been peeled and the can smashed flat. That night I heard footsteps. Not animal footsteps, human, crunching softly in the gravel near my tent. They came from the dark and stopped about 15 feet away. I held my breath, revolver ready. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. Then they backed away, quiet, deliberate. I waited another hour, then opened the tent slowly and looked out. There was nothing, but when I checked in the morning, there were prints, clear as day. Same boots, same pattern. Someone was walking up to my tent in the middle of the night and watching me. That was it. I left camp with just my pack and water and hiked without stopping. I went north. I didn't care about the Jeep. I just wanted to find a road, a town, anything. I rationed my water and checked my GPS every few minutes, praying the signal would hold. After 6 hours, I finally saw something. A dusty trail cut into the hillside and a ranch fence running alongside it. I followed it another mile and reached a dirt road. A truck passed half an hour later. I flagged it down with everything I had. A rancher in his 60s picked me up. I didn't tell him everything, just that I got lost and needed help. He drove me back to his place, gave me water, and let me use his landline to call my brother. We picked up the Jeep together the next day. When we got there, the Jeep was untouched. No scratches, no broken windows, but all the flagging tape was on the hood. Every piece I'd tied, folded and laid in a neat stack like someone was leaving a message. I never went back to that canyon. Whatever was out there, whoever was out there, was used to being alone. They moved without a sound, erased trails, and didn't want company. And I don't think they wanted me to leave, but I did. I got out because I didn't ignore the feeling that something was wrong. I got out because I didn't pretend it was nothing. Now, when I think about that week, I don't think about the stars or the quiet. I think about those boot prints in the dark, the light in the canyon, the tape on my hood, and I don't go camping alone anymore. It was early September of 2016 when I went on a solo camping trip in southern France. I had just turned 29 that summer. I worked as a freelance graphic designer based in Dublin, and after a year of barely leaving my apartment, I decided to take a long break.
No screens.
No cities, just trees, dirt, and air. I picked a quiet spot near the Tarn River, close to a small town called Ambiolet. It wasn't too popular with tourists. There were some marked hiking paths and a few old stone bridges from medieval times, but it wasn't like the Alps or the Riviera. That's why I liked it. Felt hidden. I flew into Toulouse and rented a cheap hatchback. It took me about 3 hours to drive east along winding rural roads. The land was hilly and green. Old farmhouses dotted the hills, and you'd go for miles without seeing another car. By the time I pulled off onto the dirt path that led to my planned campsite, the sun was already dipping behind the trees. I had scouted the spot on Google Maps weeks before. It was tucked along the riverbank, past a small clearing. I liked that it was far enough from any roads that no one would casually stumble across it, but not so deep in the woods that I'd get lost. I parked just off the gravel and loaded my pack. It took about 15 minutes to hike in. The trail was barely a trail, more like a game trail or old footpath. By the time I reached the clearing, the sky was orange and pink, and the sounds of birds and insects had started to rise. The place was perfect, flat with soft grass and space between the trees. Just past it was the river, wide and slow, with banks lined by tall reeds. I pitched my tent and set up camp with no issues. Cooked some canned lentils over my small stove, drank a beer, sat on a log and watched the stars come out. I slept well that first night. No strange sounds, no animals poking around, just the soft rustle of wind in the trees. The second day I spent hiking. I had downloaded a few trails to my phone and followed one that led to a stone arch about 5 kilometers away. I didn't see a single person on the trail, just birds and bugs and the occasional snake darting through dry grass. I ate lunch on a ridge overlooking the valley and was back at my tent by late afternoon. That evening I swam in the river to cool off. The current was light, the water crisp. Afterward I dried off on the rocks, read a paperback book, and cooked a basic dinner. Again, no problems, no signs of anyone else nearby. But on the third day, things started to feel off. I woke up to the sound of branches cracking somewhere in the woods. It was early, maybe just after 6, and still dim. I sat up in my tent and listened. It wasn't loud, just 1 or 2 snaps. Not close, but not far either. I figured it was an animal, maybe a deer, maybe wild boar. I had read that boars lived in this part of France. They usually kept to themselves, but they could be dangerous if cornered. I made a bit of noise when I stepped outside, hoping to scare off anything nearby. I didn't see or hear anything after that. Later that day, while exploring upriver, I thought I saw someone in the trees across the water. It was just a flash of movement, gray or tan clothing, maybe. Could have been anything. I paused, squinting across the wide stream. The opposite bank was dense with reeds and shadowed trees, and whatever I had seen was gone. I told myself it was just my imagination. But that evening, when I returned to camp, I found something that made me pause. My folding knife, which I always kept in a side pocket of my backpack, was lying open on the log by the fire pit. I froze when I saw it. My bag had been zipped shut when I left. I was sure of that. I always closed it tight to keep bugs out. I didn't leave the knife out. I never did. It wasn't something you'd forget, especially on a solo trip. I picked it up, looked around, and felt a heavy silence fall over the clearing. Everything looked the same. Tent was untouched. Food bag was hanging from the tree where I'd left it. But the knife was enough to shake me. I barely slept that night. Every sound outside made my heart pound. The wind, the trees creaking, the crack of twigs. I kept the knife in my hand under my sleeping bag and laid there for hours, staring at the tent ceiling. The next morning, I found footprints. They were faint, but I saw them clearly in the soft dirt just beyond the clearing, near the trees. Adult-sized, boot prints. Not mine. My boots left a different pattern, and I hadn't walked over there since setting up. They led toward the river, then stopped. I stood there for a long time, just listening. I didn't hear anything. I decided to stay one more night. I should have packed up and left. That would have been smart. But something in me wanted to hold on. I didn't want to admit that I was scared. I had spent 3 nights alone without trouble, and part of me thought maybe I had just been careless with the knife. Maybe the tracks were old. Maybe they were mine and I didn't realize it. I stayed close to camp that day. Didn't hike. I kept my knife in my pocket and a hatchet strapped to my side. I barely ate. I sat in the clearing for hours, just watching the trees, looking for movement. Around dusk, I thought I saw the man. He was across the river again, standing just inside the tree line. Still, not moving. He was tall and thin, wearing a dark coat or maybe a heavy shirt. I couldn't make out his face. He was too far, and the shadows had already started to stretch. I froze. My legs were locked, my body heavy. I blinked and he was gone. I backed away from the river, not turning my back, and sat beside the fire I'd started earlier. I fed more wood into it. I sat there until it was pitch black around me, only the flames lighting the clearing. All night I kept waking up. I didn't hear him, didn't see him again, but I felt it, like I was being watched. I lay there in the dark with the knife in one hand, my flashlight in the other, waiting for footsteps, waiting for a shadow to pass the tent wall. Nothing came. At dawn, I packed everything. I didn't bother with breakfast. I crammed everything into my bag and collapsed the tent in 10 minutes. I was sweating, heart pounding, checking the trees every few seconds. The walk back to the car felt like a mile. I kept thinking I'd hear him behind me, see him on the path. But the trail was empty, quiet. When I reached the car, the rear passenger door was open. I stood still for a long time, not breathing. I knew I had locked it. I checked all 4 doors when I left it. The handle had been stiff. I looked inside. Nothing was missing, but the glove box was open, and the papers inside were scattered. There was a scratch on the driver's side mirror, a deep one like it had been hit with a rock or key. I got in, locked the doors, and drove without stopping. Didn't even check my phone until I reached Albee, a town nearly 50 kilometers away. I pulled into a gas station, bought a drink, and sat in the lot breathing hard. I didn't go to the police. I didn't even tell anyone about it until months later. What would I say? That some man stood across the river from me? That my knife moved? That I saw a boot print? There wasn't a crime. Nothing stolen.
No threats.
Just wrong things. Small things. But it was real. I know it was. I never saw his face. Never heard his voice. But someone was out there with me, watching me, close enough to open my pack, close enough to get inside the car. For weeks after I got home, I kept waking up at night. I'd get up and check the locks on my doors and windows. I kept a flashlight beside my bed, my knife on the nightstand. I haven't been camping alone since. I still love the outdoors, but I stick to campsites now. The kind with families and camp hosts and bathrooms. Places with noise and light and people. Because what scared me most wasn't that there was someone out there. It was how easily he got that close without making a sound. How he never needed to do anything loud or violent. He just waited and watched, and that was enough. I was 38 when I decided to take a solo hunting trip into the hills just north of Salmon, Idaho. It was late October of 2019, and I had been needing some space. I'd been working long shifts as a mechanic in Missoula, and my nerves were shot. Hunting had always helped me reset, clear my head, and that part of Idaho had always called to me. Sparse population, endless forest, and plenty of mule deer in the colder months. I had hunted there a few times with my uncle when I was younger, but this was the first time I was heading out on my own. I packed my gear carefully, Remington 700 chambered in .30-06, a solid 2-person backpacking tent even though I was going alone, enough food for a week, a satellite communicator, a knife, first aid, water filter, and my good boots. I double-checked everything the night before I left and made sure my truck had been topped off. The plan was to drive up Route 93 until I got past North Fork, take a series of dirt Forest Service roads into a part of the Bitterroot Range that bordered the Salmon Chalice National Forest, then hike in another 3 or 4 miles to a spot my uncle had once shown me. It wasn't marked on any maps, just a basin we called the Elbow because of the shape of the ridge around it. It was quiet, out of the way, and most importantly, loaded with deer if you timed it right. I left Missoula before dawn and reached the access roads by mid-morning. It took a while to get deep enough in to where I could park without seeing any tire tracks. I always tried to avoid spots that other hunters might use. I wanted space, peace, silence. I pulled off just before a fork where an old logging trail curved up into the treeline, shouldered my pack, slung my rifle, and started walking. The hike was rougher than I remembered. The trail had eroded in places, and the underbrush had reclaimed a lot of it. I took my time, checking for signs as I climbed: scat, tracks, rubs on the trees. I spotted a couple deer tracks, but nothing fresh. The trail climbed steeply for a while before leveling out into that wide, elbow-shaped basin. The trees opened up just enough to give a view of the northern ridge. The leaves had mostly dropped by then, but some of the aspens still had yellow clinging to them, and the ground was thick with dried leaves. You could hear every step crunch for yards. I made camp near a small creek at the base of the basin, a good 30 minutes hike from the trailhead. I knew the area well enough to get around, and my GPS kept a track anyway. I set up the tent just before dusk, built a fire, boiled water, and ate a freeze-dried meal with some jerky and instant coffee. The wind picked up after sundown. The fire snapped hard, and I pulled my jacket tight and just sat watching the flames while the sky turned purple, then black. No cell signal, no cars, no people. Just wind, trees, and the occasional creak of branches shifting in the dark. I felt calm, finally. The first 2 days were uneventful. I scouted the basin, followed a game trail that wound northeast, and posted up in a natural blind by mid-afternoon each day. I didn't see much. A few does off in the distance, but they weren't moving much. I figured the rut hadn't fully kicked in yet. I did find some fairly recent buck tracks down near the creek, so I decided to stick it out. By the 3rd day, I started noticing something strange. Not dangerous, just off. First, I found a spent shotgun shell near a patch of moss behind the ridge. Not unusual on its own, except it was bent and dirty like it had been jammed and tossed. No markings on it, and definitely not mine. I didn't think much of it until I came across a small, torn-up tarp about 100 yards west of my camp. It had been caught on a stump and partially buried under leaves. Not full-size, more like something someone might use for a quick shelter. It looked like it had been there a few weeks at least. I made a mental note of it but didn't touch anything. People passed through all the time. Still, it gave me that unsettled, half-watched feeling, like I wasn't the only one out here. That night, I stayed up late by the fire again. The wind had dropped, and the forest felt unusually quiet. I didn't hear the usual cracking or rustling of small animals or branches. It was like the whole place had gone still. At some point past midnight, I thought I heard a faint clatter from the ridge above, like metal on stone or something hard being knocked over. I sat still, letting my ears adjust. It didn't come again, but it kept me up longer than I wanted. I slept light that night, and when I got up at dawn, I checked around the camp just in case. No tracks, no sign anyone had come through. The only thing that seemed out of place was a set of small scratches on a nearby pine, vertical gouges about 6 feet up. Not from a bear, too clean and too narrow. Maybe someone had climbed it or used it as a marker. Either way, I was more alert than before. That day, I moved a little farther out to the southern edge of the basin. Around mid-afternoon, I spotted a buck grazing just below the treeline, and I took the shot from about 80 yards. Clean hit right through the heart. He dropped instantly. I field dressed him quickly, loaded what I could into my pack, and hauled the first load back to camp. I left the rest hanging in a tree, wrapped in game bags the way I'd always done. By the time I returned to camp, the sun had already dipped behind the ridge. I set the meat down and started another fire. While it burned, I walked back a bit to scan the woods. That's when I noticed something strange in the underbrush, almost like a path had been pushed through the leaves. It wasn't an animal trail. It looked too wide and too deliberate, almost like someone dragging something. I followed it for about 50 feet before it just ended. No blood, no clear boot prints, no broken branches, just disturbed leaves. Back at camp, I didn't eat. My stomach was tight. I couldn't explain why, but I suddenly didn't want to be there anymore. Something about that trail and the quiet in the trees felt wrong. I stayed up with the fire until it burned low, then went into the tent with my rifle close. I left my boots on. At some point deep in the night, I woke up to the sound of branches cracking. Not small ones, but thick, slow cracks, like someone stepping heavily just beyond the fire ring. I didn't move. I lay there breathing slowly, ears straining. I heard another crack, closer this time, then a silence so complete it made my heart pound. I grabbed the rifle and slowly unzipped the flap. The coals were still glowing, but barely. I couldn't see anything, just shapes in the dark. I didn't want to call out and I didn't want to flash my light, so I waited. Eventually, the sound faded and I eased the flap closed. I didn't sleep after that. When the sky finally lightened, I got out and did a full walk around the tent. No tracks, nothing disturbed, but I swear something or someone had been close during the night. I packed the rest of the deer meat, but I didn't hang around. I loaded it up and hauled the last trip back to my truck. That should have been the end of it. But when I reached the truck, I found the driver's side mirror shattered and long, shallow scratches down the length of the door. Not claw marks, more like a knife or tool. Clean, straight, deliberate. My chest went cold. Someone had been here, maybe watching, maybe waiting. I unlocked the door, checked the inside. Everything else seemed untouched. No flat tires, no signs of forced entry. But the scratches made one thing clear: whoever was out there knew where I was. They wanted me to know I wasn't alone, that this was their place too. I didn't waste time. I got the meat packed into the cooler, gear in the back, and started driving. I made it down the winding forest road with white knuckles on the wheel, glancing in the mirror every few seconds. The wind had picked up again, rattling through the trees like whispers. I didn't stop until I hit Route 93. Only then did I feel like I could breathe. Back in Missoula, I cleaned and stored the meat, but the scratches on the truck stayed with me. I couldn't explain them. I reported it to the local sheriff, gave a rough location, and said I suspected someone might have been messing with my vehicle out in the forest. They took a statement, but nothing came of it. No follow-up, no other reports from the area. A few weeks later, I started looking through hunting forums, trying to see if anyone else had experienced anything strange in that part of the woods. Most posts were typical gear reviews, trail info, game movement. But buried in a comment thread, I found a guy talking about a camp that had been trashed out near North Fork the previous year. No gear stolen, no animals touched. Just slashed tents, a bent rifle barrel, and a ring of boot prints that didn't match the campers. He never went back. I haven't either. Something was out there. Not an animal, not some legend or story, just a person. A real person who lived or hid in that stretch of forest and didn't want anyone else around. Someone patient enough to follow without being seen. Someone close enough to watch me skin a deer and mark my truck while I slept in the woods a few miles away. I don't know if they were a squatter, a drifter, or something worse, but they were real. These days, I stick closer to known areas. I hunt near friends or in places with solid signal. I still love the woods. I still love the silence. But I don't camp alone anymore. Not after that trip. Because the scariest thing out there isn't what you can't explain. It's what you can. I was 32 when I decided to take that solo camping trip in northern Minnesota. The year was 2019. It was early September, right after Labor Day, when most of the summer tourists had gone home and the air was starting to get that early autumn bite. I'd been dealing with a pile of stress at work, working long hours at a welding shop in Duluth, and after finishing a tough project, I figured I owed myself a few quiet days in the woods. I picked a spot I'd never tried before, a ridge a few miles south of Lower Red Lake. It was far off the beaten path, and I chose it for that reason. I wanted peace, just me and the trees and no one around. I'd found it through an old hiking forum online. A guy had posted about it a few years back, said it had a great view of the water and barely anyone ever hiked up that way. That was enough for me. I packed my gear the night before: tent, sleeping bag, food, water filters, first aid kit, matches, knife, extra clothes, and my .357 revolver. I wasn't expecting trouble, but I always took it with me when I camped alone. Not for people necessarily, more for animals, especially black bears. They're usually harmless, but you never know. The drive up took about 5 hours. I left early in the morning, just after sunrise, and by the time I parked on the edge of an old logging road, it was early afternoon. The trail wasn't marked. I followed GPS coordinates and a few notes I'd printed out from the forum. It took a while to find the trailhead. It wasn't really a trail at all, more like a faded path someone had bushwhacked years ago. But once I spotted it, I was on my way. The hike in took a little over 2 hours. It wasn't too steep, but there was a lot of undergrowth, fallen branches, and thick patches of mosquitoes. I sweated hard even in the cooler air. The pack was heavy, and I had to stop a couple times to catch my breath. Still, when I reached the ridge, the view made it all worth it. The ground leveled out into a kind of clearing, a soft patch of moss and grass surrounded by tall spruce and birch trees. From the edge of the ridge, I could see a strip of red water glinting in the distance. Red Lake. It was quiet. No hum of cars, no people talking, just wind brushing through the trees and the occasional call of a distant loon. I set up camp quickly. The tent went up without issue. I laid out my sleeping bag, got my little propane stove ready, and then spent a while collecting dry wood for a fire later. Around 5, I heated up some canned chili and ate while watching the sun start to drop toward the lake. There was a strong breeze coming in from the west, and the trees swayed with it like waves. It was exactly what I'd wanted. That first night went fine. A little cold, but nothing serious. I stayed up until maybe 10, feeding the fire and staring into the dark. There was something comforting about the isolation. I felt far away from the stress, the noise, the pressure of everything back home. But the second day, things started to feel off. Not in any big, obvious way. Started small. That morning, while I was boiling water for coffee, I noticed a faint boot print a few feet from my tent. First, I figured it was mine. I checked my own boots against it. Mine were larger, size 12, and this one looked smaller, maybe a 9 or 10. Could have been from someone who camped here a week ago, I told myself. The ground wasn't damp, but it had rained a few days earlier according to the weather history, and maybe the print held. Still, it stuck in my mind. I hadn't seen or heard a soul since I got there. I shrugged it off, poured my coffee, and spent the day hiking down a slope toward the lake. Took me an hour to get there. The trees thickened as I descended, and I had to mark my way back using bits of orange tape I kept in my pack. The lake was as still as glass. I didn't see a single boat. I filled up my water bottles, filtered them, and ate a sandwich on a rock near the edge. While I was down there, I kept looking over my shoulder. I couldn't explain why. I felt like something was watching. It wasn't anything I could prove, no sound, no movement, but the feeling clung to me. like the air was just too still. I tried to shake it, but it hung there, especially when I started heading back up. When I got back to camp that afternoon, something was different. I couldn't tell what right away. My gear was all where I left it. Tent zipped, sleeping bag inside, food tied up in the bear bag hanging from a branch, stove untouched, but something still felt wrong. I did a slow circle of the site. Then I noticed it. One of the sticks I'd arranged around the fire pit had been moved, just one. I remembered how I'd set them like a star shape to help balance my cookware, but one was out of place, pointing away from the pit toward the trees. I stared at it for a long time. Then I reset it and sat by the fire ring, trying not to think too hard. Maybe a squirrel or a raccoon had knocked it over. But I didn't believe that. That night I couldn't sleep. I laid there for hours, staring at the tent ceiling. The wind was gone. Everything was still, too still. Every time a branch creaked or a leaf fell, my pulse jumped. Around 1 a.m., I heard footsteps. Slow, crunching steps on dry leaves. They came from the direction of the ridge. They weren't deer steps, too heavy. And not a bear. Bears shuffle and snort. This was different. Steady, careful. One foot, then the other. Someone trying to be quiet. I held my breath. My revolver was under my sleeping bag. I slowly slid it into my hand and stayed still. The steps came closer. Then they stopped. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. Minutes passed. Then nothing. Just silence. I don't remember falling asleep, but I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, it was light out. My mouth was dry, and my back hurt from tensing up all night. I got up, walked around, and checked the area again. That's when I found the second footprint. This one was fresher, just a few feet from the tent, in the moss. Again, smaller than my boots. Clearly not mine. Someone had been there. I packed my gear slowly that morning, trying to stay calm. I still had a day left on the trip, but something inside me said it was time to leave. I kept the revolver on my hip and moved with purpose. It took me about 20 minutes to take everything down. As I rolled my tent, I found something tucked behind a tree just outside camp. A torn piece of denim, faded blue, looked like it came from a pant leg, maybe caught on a branch. It was damp and it wasn't mine. I didn't like the feeling crawling over my skin, that tight itch along the back of my neck. I started hiking out, but I didn't make it far. About half a mile down the trail, I spotted something up ahead, barely visible through the trees. A shape. I froze and crouched low. I watched for maybe 5 minutes. No movement. Then I started to circle wide, trying to stay hidden. As I got closer, I realized it was a lean-to, a makeshift shelter. It hadn't been there 2 days ago, built from pine branches and a plastic tarp. No markings, no sign of ownership. A couple of empty cans nearby. No fire ring, no sleeping bag. Whoever had made it had done so recently, within the last 48 hours. And they were still out here. I didn't stick around. I turned back the way I came, moving fast and quiet. My heart pounded. I kept glancing behind me every few seconds. I took out the revolver and kept it in my hand the whole way. I didn't stop. Not to eat. Not to drink. 2.5 hours later, I was back at the truck. Everything looked untouched. No signs of tampering. I opened the door, threw my gear in the back seat, and drove out without even changing my boots. My hands shook the whole time. I didn't stop until I hit the highway. Later that night, back home in Duluth, I couldn't sleep. My legs were still sore, and my mind wouldn't slow down. I kept thinking about the boot prints, the lean-to, the footsteps, the way everything had felt just slightly off. A few days later, I logged back into that hiking forum. The post about the ridge, gone. The guy who made it, his profile had been deleted. No trace of the coordinates, no mention of the place anywhere else on the site. I never went back. I still don't know who was out there. Maybe a hunter. Maybe someone living off the grid. Maybe something worse. All I know is I wasn't alone. And they knew I was there. Knew where I slept. Knew when I left. And for some reason, they didn't want me to find them, but didn't mind letting me know they were watching. It's been years, and I still wake up sometimes thinking I hear those slow, careful footsteps outside my window. But it was real. It happened, and I won't ever go camping alone again. I was 32 that summer, working construction jobs across northern Arizona. I'd been on the road for over 4 months, bouncing between contracts, trying to save up enough to put a down payment on a small place outside of Flagstaff. Work was steady but exhausting. I'd gotten used to sleeping in my truck or cheap motels, eating gas station food, and seeing my hands stay dirty no matter how many times I scrubbed them. That August, I decided to take a break. I hadn't had a proper day off in weeks, and the last few job sites were especially rough. We were pouring concrete foundations in 105-degree heat, surrounded by nothing but dry air and red dirt. So when we wrapped up a gig early near Winslow, I took off a few days early and drove north to the Chinle area. I'd heard from another guy on the crew that there were quiet spots in the high desert where you could camp alone and not see another soul for days. That's exactly what I wanted. Just a break from everything. I wasn't new to camping and I liked going alone. I always found a weird comfort in the isolation. No noise, no people, just the land. That kind of silence cleared my head. I had a full tank of gas, a case of water in the back, freeze-dried meals, my old sleeping bag, my .38 in the glove box, and a secondhand canvas tent that still smelled like mildew, even after 3 years of use. I drove west out of Chinle, then took an unmarked dirt road heading south into the desert. There were no signs or fences, just wide open country. My tires kicked up thick clouds behind me as the road turned into rocky terrain. About 45 minutes in, I pulled off near a shallow ridge with a good view of the plain below. There were old cattle trails nearby, but I didn't see any fresh tracks. No fences, no buildings, no parked cars. Just dry brush, dusty hills, and that deep, empty desert air that always feels heavier after sunset. It was perfect. I set up camp about 30 yards from the edge of the ridge. I pitched the tent facing the open plain. There were some juniper trees scattered behind me and a dry wash that ran parallel to the ridge, maybe 20 feet down the slope. I parked my truck next to the tent for wind cover. It was quiet, too quiet actually, and I remember that sticking with me. Not even the constant chirping of birds or bugs. Just that soft wind passing through the brush like it was trying not to wake anything. I spent the first few hours just walking the area, stretching my legs, collecting firewood, listening. No music, no phone, just being there. That first night was uneventful. I cooked some rice and beans over a small fire, drank 2 beers, then crawled into the tent and fell asleep to the soft groaning of wind pushing through the tent flaps. I didn't even dream. I slept deep. It was the second night when things started to feel wrong. That morning I had hiked about 2 miles down a long dry gully. I followed some deer tracks but never saw any animals. The further I went, the more I started seeing things like old fence posts, barbed wire buried under sand, and the remains of some kind of structure, maybe a shed or old homestead. Just a few rotted boards and a rusted wheel. The air out there felt old. That's the only way I can describe it. Like time just didn't move the same. I left around mid-afternoon when it got too hot to keep going. I was back at camp by 4, sweating and covered in dust. That evening, as the sun dropped behind the ridge, I started hearing what I thought were coyotes, but the calls were off. They didn't sound like coyotes I was used to. I grew up around farms in New Mexico, and I've heard hundreds of them, high-pitched, yipping, barking. But this was different. It was slower, One long howl, not quite human, not quite animal. Like someone imitating a coyote but getting the pitch just a little wrong. And then silence. No chorus of yips. Just that single, stretched out call that faded too quickly. I figured it was just an old or sick coyote. Maybe a lone one. I didn't think much of it. Not until I heard it again a few hours later, only this time it was closer. I was sitting in the truck bed watching the stars, letting my food settle. There was no fire going, just moonlight and a breeze that had picked up since sundown. Then that same howl came again, from down the wash this time. It was closer than before. I'd say maybe 100 yards out. I froze. Something about the way it ended, it didn't taper off like a real howl. Cut off sharp like it had been stopped. And then came the silence.
No crickets.
No wind. I climbed down, grabbed my flashlight, and swept the area. But there was nothing. I walked to the ridge edge and scanned the slope. Nothing moved. I felt watched, though. That old heavy feeling in your chest like something is nearby and just waiting. I slept in the truck that night with the .38 in my lap. I left the tent zipped and untouched. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up sweating. The air had gone completely still, and the temperature dropped hard. It had to be below 40. I sat up and looked out the windshield. I saw someone standing at the edge of the wash. At first, I thought it was a tree or maybe a deer, but the shape didn't move. It just stood there, tall, thin, and facing my direction. No light.
No eyesine.
Just a dark figure, barely outlined against the slope. I stayed frozen, breathing shallow, trying to keep quiet. I blinked and reached for the flashlight, and when I turned it on, the figure was gone.
No footsteps.
No sound. I didn't sleep again until the sun came up. I packed up camp the next morning, but for some reason, I didn't leave. I don't know why. Maybe pride. Maybe stupidity. I kept telling myself it was just a trick of the light, or my brain playing games after too many days alone. I'd driven all that way, and I wanted to finish the trip. So I set up again, but this time I kept the fire going most of the day. The smoke gave me some sense of control. That night, everything got worse. I kept the .38 on my hip. I cooked early, then stacked the firewood high, enough to last until midnight. Around dusk, I noticed the birds were back. Briefly, they scattered just as fast. As night fell, I heard something walking near the ridge. Not a coyote, not a deer. This was 2 legs, crunching slow, deliberate. Then the call came again. Same stretched out howl. But this time it was directly behind the tent. 30 feet away, maybe less. I didn't move. Then I heard it speak. Not real words, just a garbled mess. Like someone trying to form human sounds but not getting it right. It was quiet, raspy, almost like a voice that had never learned to talk. It muttered for maybe 5 seconds, then stopped. I stood slowly, holding the flashlight in one hand and the pistol in the other. When I turned the light toward the trees, there was nothing there. But I smelled something, wet, earthy, like rotting leaves or an animal left out in the sun.
I've smelled roadkill.
I've smelled dead deer after 3 days. This was worse. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the truck, windows cracked, watching the wash and the tree line. Every time I started to drift, I'd hear movement. Soft, dragging steps circling the tent. Sometimes twigs snapped. Once, something brushed the side of the truck bed. At one point, I thought I saw a face pressed against the passenger side window. But when I jumped, gun raised, there was nothing there. By morning, the tracks were gone. Not a single footprint, not a broken twig. I drove out that day. Fast. When I got back to Chinle, I stopped at a gas station to fill up and buy a coffee. I looked like hell. Mud on my jeans, red dust in my beard, eyes bloodshot. The old man behind the counter didn't say anything until I turned to leave. Then he said one thing very low. Don't go off them roads alone. Not out there. I didn't reply. I didn't want to know more. I got in the truck and kept driving. That was 3 years ago. I haven't camped alone since. I still work the same jobs, still sleep in my truck sometimes, but I don't go out into the desert by myself anymore. And sometimes, on really quiet nights, I hear that same stretched out call in the distance. Maybe it's just my memory playing tricks, but every time I hear it, I remember standing on that ridge, flashlight shaking in my hand, and seeing a man, or something shaped like one, just watching. I don't think it was a coyote. I don't think it was a man either, but it was real, and it was out there,